quote, "Being a politician is a poor profession. Being a public servant is a noble one," unquote, said Herbert Hoover. This statement by our 33rd President, Herbert Hoover, clearly articulates the life goal that he had concerning his service to our nation and to society in general. However, who was this president? And what were his accomplishments? And why is he commonly associated with the Great Depression that our nation had during the 1930s? The life of Herbert Hoover, the rich heritage, legacy, and life that he impressed upon the history of our nation, all the more exposes his ultimate commitment to service. Born on August 10th of 1874 in West Branch, Iowa, Herbert Clark Hoover was born to Jesse and Huldah Hoover. As the second of 3 children born in this Quaker family, Herbert Hoover's birth was proclaimed with great vigor by his father Jesse, as Jesse predestined his son's future hard work and success, saying, quote, "We have another General Grant in our house," end quote. This reference denoted General Ulysses S. Grant, who was U.S. President at that time, and Ulysses Grant was known for his cunning skills and abilities, as well as the numerous Union victories that he had during the Civil War, which had ended 9 years prior to Herbert Hoover's birth. Life in West Branch, Iowa was filled with immense excitement as Herbert grew. Because of his family's Quaker upbringing, Herbert was taught from a young age to preserve peace and unity, and this, of course, trained him in moral uprightness. Herbert had a wilderness boy lifestyle. As he ran along the Iowan prairies, he hunted with a traditional bow and arrow and would fish for sunfish and catfish in nearby rivers and streams. However, Herbert's carefree and enjoyable lifestyle in West Branch, Iowa quickly changed as his father passed, suffering a heart attack. In addition to this harsh loss, his mother contracted pneumonia and passed as well 3 years later. So at 9 years old, Herbert, his older brother Theodore, and his sister Mary were orphaned and passed from relative to relative. Herbert was separated from his other 2 siblings, but he found residence with his uncle John Minthorn in the state of Oregon. Now, Uncle John was not an easy man. He made sure Herbert went to church, did his chores, and did his homework. Attending the Friends Pacific Academy in Newberg, Oregon, Herbert was not the most popular student in his class. In addition to his coyness and his introversion, his grades were average. Despite that fact, the future engineer and president was determined to go to Stanford University in Palo Alto, California, and he worked toward that end. He studied hard and tried to improve his grades. His efforts weren't futile, but they only slimly aided in his acceptance to Stanford University. At Stanford, Herbert took his education to a whole new level. Staying out of considerable debt during his schooling, he worked hard and maintained jobs to keep his education funded. Pursuing a degree in geology, the avid Herbert was deeply involved in school activities, including his positions as class manager and secretary of the baseball and football clubs. In addition to his educational positions, he took active roles in business initiatives, running a newspaper and laundry route throughout the university. It was at Stanford University that he met his future wife, Lou Henry, who was also a geology major. The spring of 1895 arrived as Herbert Hoover graduated with a degree in geology from the prestigious Stanford University. And no sooner did he graduate was he confronted with the working world. As a recent graduate, Herbert was literally put to work. Slaving away in the deep, dark mines, he worked at the Reward Gold Mine near Nevada City, California. Following his time as a miner, he gradually rose in status, changing mines as he went. He was named assistant manager of Steeple Mine in Carlisle, New Mexico, and his job there was to supervise working and mining operations. And through those experiences, he gained leadership initiatives that he had practiced at Stanford years before. Hoover had a wide range of experiences, as after leaving Steeple Mine, he worked as a hydraulic inspector at another mine, a gravel mine in Colorado. The significance of his work was that he learned not only about the essence of mining, but also firsthand interacted with and experienced life as it was for a certain group of individuals. His operations went global as he traveled to Western Australia as a mine manager for a Bewick mooring firm in May of 1897. Australia, particularly the western half, had not yet been fully developed, and the dry western parts were apt for mining as hundreds of thousands of miners packed and slaved away in the deep mines. During his time in Australia, Hoover managed and supervised and ordered operations for mining firms. In overseeing many different mine sites, the future president worked hard at internal operations and management. Despite his success in Australia, he was suggested to go to China to work as a mining engineer. Hoover agreed to go to China, but not before stopping back to the United States. He momentarily stopped in Monterey, California, and married his Stanford sweetheart Lou Henry, and their marriage ceremony was literally hastily, followed by their sail across the vast Pacific Ocean to China. The Chinese Empire was a mysterious place at this time. Ruled over 3 centuries by the dominating Qing dynasty, the nation proved a somewhat belligerent place, with the estrangement of the nobleman hierarchy and the menial working-class peasants. Arriving in China in 1898, Herbert and Lou Hoover were welcomed with the gradual incitement of the Boxer Rebellion. 2 years after their arrival, the rebellion, which pronounced the extermination of foreigners from the empire, violently erupted. Trapped in a foreigner's compound in Tianjin, China, Herbert and other foreigners built barricades to insulate themselves from the uprising. But their efforts were superseded by the intensity and widespread damage caused by the rebellion. With great haste to leave, the Hoovers narrowly escaped Tianjin on a German mail ship en route to London. Years later, after the violence had subsided, they returned once again to China, where Herbert directed a highly successful mining operation. After this very successful mining operation, they left China once again and traveled back to London, where they had been in refuge years before. And now this English city, London, was the center of steel manufacturing in England, a place that lent Herbert Hoover much interaction considering his involvement in mining. And here in London, 2 of the Hoover children were born, Herbert Jr. in 1903 and his younger brother Alan in 1907. Now Herbert and Lou Hoover raised their children in London for the next several years. But with the outset of World War I in 1914, thousands of Americans living in Europe rushed to exit the continent due to the war. With pouring amounts of American families and individuals leaving countries like Germany, Belgium, France, and the United Kingdom, Herbert Hoover directed the Committee of American Residents in London for assistance to American travelers. Now that long-named organization basically helped over 120,000 American families living in Europe find safe passages by ship back to the United States. The leadership and initiative Herbert Hoover had refined during his time as a mining engineer and supervisor had paid off greatly during this time of need. Truly, after directing this committee, Hoover would, until the end of his life, be majorly involved in humanitarian and leadership efforts. With war comes famine, and this was an enormous problem in the nation of Belgium during World War I, as Germany sought to overtake this small nation. Struggling families labored to stay alive and afloat, and their cry of help and their cry of need reached the ear and the heart of Herbert Hoover. Striving to help, he founded the Committee for Relief of Belgium, an organization dedicated to supervising and directing the food distribution relief to the Belgian people. Faced with millions of people to feed, Hoover broke down his problems into separate sections and addressed each section with strong leadership and firm initiative. The efforts that he invested in helping the Belgian people paid off with great rewards. Records, as referenced by the Hoover Presidential Library and Museum, note that, quote, through the 4 years of Hoover's CRB, that's the Committee for Relief of Belgium, he fed 11 million people in Belgium and northern France. And he collected more than $1 billion to finance the operations, end quote. Such commendations of his performance and humanitarian efforts prompted U.S. Ambassador to the United Kingdom Walter Hines Page to note Hoover as, quote, a simple, modest, energetic little man who began his career in California and will end it in heaven. And he doesn't want anyone's thanks, unquote. Page's description of Hoover can not only be said during his time in Europe, but also to his life in general. The United States during the first 3 years of World War I remained neutral due to the push by President Woodrow Wilson to remain neutral among conflict, and instead advocated measures of peace and of world democracy. However, this all changed with the introduction of the Zimmermann telegraph. And this Zimmermann telegraph was sent from Germany to Mexico, and it was decoded by British spies, and it basically essentially stated that Germany would help Mexico if Mexico began to invade the southwestern United States. And Britain passed that news along to the United States, which greatly infuriated President Wilson. Because of the discovery of the Zimmermann telegraph, as well as some belligerence that had happened on the seas, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war. And the United States issued a declaration of war against Germany on April 6, 1917. Desperate in Washington for a leader to oversee food rations and continuous equilibrium of resources on the home front, President Woodrow Wilson appointed the very famous Herbert Hoover as a U.S. food administrator. Hoover accepted this job, which required him to provide and ration foods to ensure that all people, citizens and armed militants, had enough to consume each day. With a strong backbone in management and leadership, Hoover was the right man for the job. His food distribution and rationing plans were often called Hooverizing, as the process by which Hoover ensured enough food was fairly methodical. One of his main tactics was to persuade the American people that they should consume what they truly needed and leave the excess for additional food redistribution. This effort was manifested by food conservation campaigns with slogans such as, "Help to win the war," "Food will win the war," "Waste nothing." In addition, he implemented day-by-day sort of food conservation days, including Wheatless Wednesdays and Meatless Mondays. Hoover's efforts did not result in failure, as most American families remained afloat during World War I. When the World War ended in 1918 by the Treaty of Versailles, Hoover was a national hero. He was dubbed the name the Great Engineer for his significant contributions as the mastermind of planning and manifesting food conservation in America. The beginning of the Roaring Twenties began with the 1920 election of President Warren G. Harding of Ohio. As the handpicked Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover was once again dedicated to serving the American people in the executive branch. He served wholeheartedly and efficiently. Dealing with many business and commercial affairs, Herbert Hoover always kept in mind the distinction between government and private enterprise, a mindset that placed him in the favor of many businessmen. As Secretary, Hoover strived to reorganize and reform Washington and his particular post by ensuring that necessary actions and precautions were instated to provide a better infrastructure for him to proceed about providing the best services to the American people. Holding the government's keys to private enterprise, Hoover took his job very seriously. He toiled to cut government waste, boost economic and industrial success, develop foreign trade strategies, and formulate ideas for efficiently developing and utilizing America's natural resources. During his tenure as Secretary of Commerce, Hoover also presided over the American Child Health Organization, and this group was dedicated to improving the lives of children across America by advocating disease immunizations as well as healthy lunches in schools. This initiative that Herbert Hoover participated in improved the lives of thousands of children across the United States. The death of President Harding in 1923 placed Calvin Coolidge in the White House, and continuing throughout Coolidge's presidency as the Secretary of Commerce, Hoover daily continued to improve the lives of others. And one of his greatest accomplishments was dealing with the flood of 1927. Now what had happened was heavy rains had caused the Mississippi River to overflow causing flooding from as north as Illinois, as south as Louisiana, where the Mississippi River emptied into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, President Coolidge had commissioned Secretary Hoover and other environmentalists to consider the problem and to formulate a rational solution. And coordinating between the needs of the people and his vision, Herbert Hoover set up his efforts to clear the region of devastation. Coordinating with the Red Cross, he began initiatives and medical stations to methodically eliminate diseases that individuals had contracted as a result of the contaminated water. Hoover's work during the flood had the same result of all other projects he had been involved in, and that was success. And this success further catapulted him to national attention, and the upcoming 1928 presidential election was no exception. Masses of letters and phone calls inundated Hoover with implorations for him to run for president. Though faced with a daunting choice, Hoover took the challenge for presidency. He was placed on a platform that prepared him for victory against Democrat Al Smith of New York. Smith, a staunch opponent to Prohibition, had alienated Southern Democrats as they held varying views. On the other hand, Herbert Hoover, aided by popularity by his previous decisions and experiences, supported Prohibition and lower taxes for Americans. In addition, his campaign promised a chicken in every pot and 2 cars in every garage. And this phrase meant that life under a Hoover administration would ensure additional success and wealth for the American people. During one of his campaign speeches in Madison Square Garden, New York, delivered October of 1928, he exposed his plan for American success by saying, quote, "We are nearer today to the ideal of abolition of poverty and fear from the life of American men and women than ever before in any land. Again, I repeat that the departure from our American system by injecting principles destructive to it, which our opponents propose, will jeopardize the very liberty and freedom of our people, and will destroy equality and opportunity not only to ourselves, but to our children." End quote. In addition, Hoover was supported and liked by the American public because he strived to think and look through the very eyes and mind that the voters were looking and thinking through. Espousing a modest degree of government intervention, Herbert Hoover advocated a government that would look out for the interests of the people, as he proclaimed, quote, "The government is more than an administration. It is power for leadership and cooperation with the forces of business and cultural life in city, town, and countryside," end quote. Hoover swept the 1928 presidential election, capturing even Smith's home state of New York. With a 444 to 87 margin in the Electoral College, an advantage of 6 million votes in the popular vote, Hoover had definitively and resolutely captured the heart and the mind and the essence of the American people. Inaugurated in March of 1929, Hoover began his work as the 31st President of the United States. Out of a heart of benevolence, he chose to donate his entire presidential salary to charities. Despite that fact, he had a lot in store for him in the next 4 years. Hoover ran his campaign and presidency on a definitive conservative approach which advocated less governmental intervention and increased personal freedom. In his 1928 Rugged Individualism campaign speech, he advocated, quote, "that by adherence to the principles of decentralized self-government, ordered liberty, equal opportunity, and freedom to the individual, our American experiment in human welfare has yielded a degree of well-being unparalleled in the world," end quote. Unfortunately, scholars have noted that the perspective Herbert Hoover took, his lack of governmental intervention, did in some manner harm him in his ability to address the needs of the nation and direct it effectively. PBS scholars have noted that, quote, "his firm belief in American individualism blinded him to the necessity for governmental intervention in even the most dire of circumstances," end quote. Though he was most commonly known as president during the stock market crash in 1929, it is crucially important to look at all the details surrounding the crash in order to procure a full picture of the true behind-the-scenes information. Herbert Hoover, being involved in business for many years, knew that the stock market was dangerous. And it was noted that he told President Coolidge to watch out for the increased spending and buildup of the stock market. In addition, as president, he requested the examination of bank systems, and he implored then New York Governor Franklin Roosevelt to increase tougher restrictions on the New York Stock Exchange. However, his implorations were not instated or were not necessarily successful in that manner, as Wall Street crashed on October 29, 1929, a devastating blow not only to the United States economy, but to Hoover's presidency as well. This crash set off a nationwide depression, most commonly known as the Great Depression, which lasted from 1929 to around 1941. In addition to the outset of the Great Depression, Hoover's presidency was plagued by the Great Drought of 1930. This drought left millions of acres of land in the Great Plains states of Nebraska and Kansas and the surrounding areas dry completely, forcing thousands of desolate farmers to move west to California. Professor David Kennedy, he's a professor emeritus of history at Stanford University, stated that, quote, Herbert Hoover, elected just months after his lavish testimonies to his peerless competence, integrity, and can-do talents, saw his presidency shattered. Though, again, contrary to legend, he toiled valiantly, using what tools he had and even inventing some new ones to get the upper hand, end quote. And that's clearly true, because to remedy the burdening weights of problems addressed to him, President Hoover sought to methodically break apart the problems and address them with solutions. But unfortunately, many of his proposals were met with harsh condemnations, and his program for public works was overrun by criticism for increased spending measures. To make things worse, Europe's economy erupted in disaster, growing the depression from the United States to around the world. However, Hoover finally gained some ground when Congress passed his Reconstructive Financial Corporation, the RFC. Now, this organization within the government basically helped American families, farmers, and corporations by providing them with federal stimuli. Now, even though this worked very well, the RFC was not enough to gain increased approval of Hoover by the American public. Many desolate Americans lived in menial shacks, a stark contrast to the big mansions and houses that they were pursuing just years before during the Roaring '20s. Mass regions of these dark, dirty, flimsy shacks and slums were dubbed Hoovervilles, a direct slam against the supposedly disastrous effects of President Hoover's policies. Amidst the cloud of struggles that blanketed Hoover's presidency, it is important to know that each commander-in-chief that has led our nation has impacted the American people in many positive ways. During the 4 short years that Hoover had, he planned the Grand Coulee and the Hoover Dam, for which he is named after. He made negotiations with Canada for the construction of the St. Lawrence Waterway. He designated over 5 million acres for national parks and forests. He signed an act to make the Star-Spangled Banner our national anthem. He reorganized the Federal Bureau of Investigation and reformed criminal punishments. He also advocated world peace, most notably in Asia, with the introduction of the Hoover-Stimson Act, and he implemented a good neighbor policy with Latin America, improving diplomatic relations between the United States and nations like Nicaragua and Haiti. However, the American people focused mainly on numbers. 13 million people were out of work in 1932. 18 million people on federal relief. With an almost equivalent margin by which he was elected in 1928, Herbert Hoover was beaten in 1932 by Democrat challenger Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Nonetheless, Herbert Hoover left the White House with the same passion he had entering it, a desire to serve others. And this led him to several post-presidency prospects that continue to exemplify and typify his daily commitment to service. He presided over the Boys Club of America, and with the entrance of the United States in the Second World War in late 1941, he voluntarily joined the Polish Relief Commission. And this was an organization very similar to the committee he had formed in Belgium during World War I years before. And his efforts, along with help from other volunteers, fed 300,000 children in war-stricken Poland. During his time of service, Lou Hoover passed in January of 1944 due to a heart attack, an event that saddened Hoover. Although he was a widower and partially disgraced president, Hoover did not allow his circumstances to define who he was. The conclusion of the war not only brought significant changes for this former president, as he was requested by President Harry Truman to aid in the Famine Emergency Commission in overseeing and directing food distribution to end post-war famine in Europe. In 1947, Congress asked Hoover to erect a comprehensive reorganization and reconstruction plan of the executive branch in an organization called the Little Hoover Commission. And many of the 280 recommendations that Hoover made were implemented. Following his years of public service and involvement, Herbert Hoover retired to a peaceful retirement life, spending much of his time reading and writing books, including American Individualism, The Ordeal of Woodrow Wilson, which was an autobiography of the former president, and The Challenge to Liberty. His presidential library and museum were dedicated in his hometown of West Branch, Iowa, on his 88th birthday in 1962, and his sense of American pride and commitment to markedly American principles were reflected in his address at the dedication ceremony as he looked toward the future with great hope. He said, quote, "The mightiest assurances of our future are the intangible spiritual and intellectual forces in our people, which we express not by the word the United States, but by the word America. That word America carries meanings which lie deep in the soul of our people. It reaches far beyond the size of cities and factories. It springs from our religious faith, our ideals of individual freedom and equal opportunity, which have come in the centuries since we landed on these shores. It rises from our pride in great accomplishments of our nation, and from the sacrifices and devotion of those who have passed on. It lifts us above the ugliness of the day. It has guided us through even greater crises of the past. And from these forces, solutions will come again." End quote. This man of faith and strong belief in God was almost unshakable. He asserted his, quote, "stern grounding of religious faith." The Quaker upbringing he had never left him, and his love for children was epitomized by his extension of invitation for all boys and girls to explore life and make the best effort to reach their full potential, saying that, quote, "the doors of opportunity are still open to you. Today, the durability of freedom is more secure in America than any other place in the world." End quote. Herbert Hoover passed at the ripe age of 90 in New York City in October 1964. This man was more than perceived by the public eye. If there were one thing to focus on President Hoover, it would not be solely on his presidency. It was more than that. Though faced with hard decisions in all of his life, Herbert Hoover was unremittingly committed to serving others with everything that he had, whether it was physically, emotionally, mentally, or financially. The preconceived notions of his reputation being grounded only on the stock market crash of 1929 are faulty. The entirety of his motives, action, and life, for that matter, are required for a full, wholesome perspective of this remarkable individual. Herbert Hoover will remain treasured in the heart of America because, as a man wholly dedicated to serving people, he was a definite demonstration and exhibition of a servant. Not a leader, not a boss, not a president, but a servant. And by this, it is evident that his quote of "being a public servant is a noble profession" is duly and entirely manifest.